So I'd like to begin the panel with asking each of the panelists to talk a little bit about the personal journey that led you to your role today. Perhaps some of the things about your background, your family, the culture, and anything of note. So maybe we can start with Betsy for this round.
Well, you heard a little bit about my first time going to Haiti, but I did come from a very interesting background. I grew up in a group home, so my parents were like foster parents, but these weren't simple, lovely little homeless children. I grew up with very difficult children, and I was born essentially into a home of 20 wayward boys, as they were called back in the 50s. So that was the kind of environment that I grew up in most of my life, and when I became married, I did the same thing. I was a 22-year-old bride that raised 6 boys from 11 to 16 into independence. My education is in Old Testament theology. So I studied New Testament theology too, so I attended what is now known as Canadian Mennonite University. I am a Mennonite of Russian Mennonite heritage. I'm the first generation, and I did attend Rockaway Mennonite School, and you are the neighbor here to Conrad Grebel University. And I first went to Haiti, as I mentioned, as a teenager, and I essentially did it. It was a fun, adventuresome kind of thing, but I've been known to say that when you're the firstborn of Russian Mennonite parents, you essentially have no childhood. You're born to work and to be responsible. And so that was the kind of environment I was raised in. So going to Haiti meant if I embraced Haiti in some way, I would have to assume some level of responsibility, and I had no intentions of doing that. And I would say, probably put up a shield between myself and Haiti for the next 30 years, and it was not for want of trying with my father. That first trip was a trip where he was invited by a business colleague of his to visit a hospital for children with tuberculosis. And my dad is a great visionary and a great fundraiser, and this really captured his imagination. They were wanting him to raise money to do a nationwide inoculation program against tuberculosis. And this was hugely intriguing to my dad because it was considered next to impossible, and he did exactly that. So that was my introduction to Haiti, and I kind of left it at that. And so I got married, raised my children. My parents eventually moved to Haiti in 1984. And my father had decided that through the experience of visiting the country from one end to the other, that inoculating children against tuberculosis was not going to solve the problems of this country. And he believed that the answer to the country of Haiti was to invest in agriculture production, and in his colorful way to empower the poorest of the poor to be masters of their own destiny. And so he took out a charter in 1980 called the Foundation for International Development Assistance, which had precisely that mandate to go to end-of-road communities to seek out potential and how one could increase their economic lives through agriculture production. He believed that a country that cannot feed itself will forever be poor, and Haiti is exactly that. It was about 30 years later that I finally agreed. I had a career in marketing and advertising, and my children were out of school, and I agreed to take this job on for 3 years. I said, I'm in, I'm out. It's 3 years and that's it. And that was almost 18 years ago.
Mike, go ahead.
Well, I'll start in a slightly different place, although I knew that I wanted to hear what this panel was about when I read who was on it. I came from a completely different background then. I came from a Catholic family with 5 siblings, 2 parents who just celebrated their 65th wedding anniversary last summer. And my dad, when I was 16, asked me what I wanted to do, and he doesn't remember this, so it may actually be just me fabricating something. But my answer that I remember was the most good for the most people, which was a very Catholic thing to say. And the only difference is I've really tried to stick to that. And so I can say clearly that I failed, because it's actually impossible to do the most good for the most people, because you're always making mistakes along the way, so then you've already fallen behind on your goal. But it has made me very focused during the time that I've had to try to think how to do that. And so I think I've gotten to the place that I should have gotten to 30 years ago, but getting there is still worthwhile. So first and most important, when I'm talking to students, I have to mention that I had the best idea for a 5th year of university. So first of all, I graduated having lived in room 303 of St. Jerome's College for 4 years. So I stared at St. Paul's for the entire time of my residency. And my only claim to fame is I was the creek jumping champion, which you guys probably don't even know what that means because you can't possibly jump Laurel Creek right now, but you could in those days. St. Paul's wasn't involved, just Notre Dame and St. Jerome's. When I finished university, I did one more year's summer job. Me and a friend in high school who'd planned this from high school put backpacks on our backs and spent the next 4 months going through North America and Europe, at which point he got sick of me and sick of the trip and left. I then went down to Greece and took a bus across to India, spent 10 weeks in India, flew across to Bangkok, down to Singapore, over to Australia, hitchhiked to Australia, came back home, having gone all the way around the world for $3,500. So if anybody wants to know how to travel cheap, talk to me afterwards. I have methods and techniques that you would have never thought of. I can get you through the States at $5 a night. But anyway. So that, I mention it for 2 reasons. I want to inspire people to think of traveling. But if I hadn't done that trip, I wouldn't be here where I am today. I would have been in some other place doing some other thing. Because when I came back from the trip, then I wanted one more set of summer jobs. I got offered 3 because I thought I was going to take my master's, which I didn't end up doing. And I chose Toronto because I thought that's where I could do the most good for the most people, because I was coming from having lived in a town of 6,000 people called Sturgeon Falls in Northern Ontario. So it's the last place I should have gone, but it's the place I felt I had to go. I then started working in cooperatives. And so I was helping start cooperatives. So actually, I didn't realize it. I was training as a social entrepreneur from the very first time, because that was a volunteer effort. Found housing cooperatives. I only had 3 jobs. I laughed when they said, tell me your career path. Well, 3 jobs, no promotions. But the first job was environmental planner at the city of Scarborough, which taught me very quickly the city of Scarborough did not care about the environment. I left that to work for Lantana Nonprofit Homes. For 10 years, I basically trained to become a competent economic development officer for housing. That's really what the training was, is to become a competent developer, which is effectively also a social entrepreneur potentially. That gave me the ability, once that company ended, to start Options for Homes. And Options for Homes then allowed me to start learning about access to wealth. And that's what's turned out to be most important to me, is understanding that the current framework within which we all work does not allow social enterprise to work. So as long as we stick to the framework of each of us struggling for the most money we can get for ourselves, we'll get nowhere. And so what Options has discovered is that the wealth that we create needs to be given away. So Options for Homes is a 1 to 5 organization. Do people know what that is? The top paid person cannot be paid more than 5 times the lowest paid person. The top paid person at Options for Homes could earn 4 times as much as they're currently being paid. So unless you're willing to work for a fair amount for your efforts, you'll not be at Options for Homes. So that you already have the right mindset. All the profits that our companies generate go into a pool that are used to further the activities of companies like ours. So the wealth management that our technique has developed is incredibly important to social enterprise and to people who want to learn how to fit it into the current culture. Last thing I'll mention, because you're an international development group, the single most important economic development opportunity that exists for every country in the South is their pent-up housing need. In the 1950s, and study this, in the 1950s, the Canadian economy was built on the back of easy credit to veterans that had come back from the Second World War. Everybody has forgotten that lesson because it's so far ago. Canada produces 200,000 units a year right now. Congo, 80 million people, produces 3,000 units a year. That country could produce 5,000 units a year, produce 2.5 million jobs. We could intelligently help Africans themselves produce housing to a level that would produce 5 to 10 million jobs. and tell me that that won't make a difference on that continent. And that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you, Mike.
I will be around afterwards. Did I already say that?
Great. Thank you. Mitra.
Yes. Well, I was born in Iran, and I spent the first few years of my life there before moving to Canada. And I think I share this with you because my family background and my cultural background really inform my journey. My family in Iran has quite a lot of experience with social justice. My grandmother runs her own microfinance NGO in Iran, helping women and children who either lost their fathers or their partners during the Iran-Iraq War. My great aunt in Iran was the first female lawyer, and she was the first female senator, and she helped to end child marriage in Iran. Of course, this is all before the revolution, so all of her work was thrown down the drain. So I had these really amazing role models in my life, but what was missing for me really was the vocabulary to express what I wanted to do. For Persians, the most important career path is doctor, lawyer, engineer, or dentist. A lot of you are smiling and nodding. I did not want to do any of those things, and I really couldn't express the path that I wanted to take. So the words that I used was international human rights law. And so that's the route that I was going down all throughout my teenage years, and even helped inform my decisions as to what courses to take in my undergrad, because I just thought it doesn't matter what I studied in undergrad, I was going to end up in law school and be an international human rights lawyer. Well, so it got to that point in my life where I had to make those tentative first steps to taking the LSATs and applying, and after doing those and doing some internships with lawyers, I realized I did not want to be a lawyer. It was the farthest thing from anything that I found interesting. It was so far removed from anything hands-on, and that's what I really wanted. I wanted to do something hands-on. And I really struggled. I hit a couple of years where I just really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I somehow managed to come to the decision that I was going to go back to school and become a social worker. And it was because of that wanting to do something hands-on, something involved in social justice, but most importantly hands-on, that I took this path. And through studying social work and having to do a practicum, having to do practical work experience, that's how I came and stumbled upon the whole sector of international development. And I was lucky enough to do a volunteer placement with Canada World Youth, and then subsequently another volunteer placement in Togo, as Kim mentioned, with Canadian Crossroads International. And through those experiences, that was how I learned the words international development, and that's how I learned that this was actually what I had always been wanting to do, but didn't know that this sector existed. I think all along I had been moving down this direction, but I had to take this really roundabout, meandering path in order to figure it out, and in order to learn that these roles and these organizations and this amazing work existed. And 12 years later, here I am.
Thank you, Mitra.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. So my story is that I grew up in Ontario, basically Sarnia for a number of years, and then moved to Toronto. Father worked as an engineer, and when I was very young, that's what I thought I was going to do. So I went through schooling thinking that maths and science is where I enjoyed it. That's what I was going to become. By the end of high school, I started doubting my abilities and that interest, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I just took some time off when I finished high school just to reflect. And I went to a high school that was Catholic, and it had a strong social justice, and we were learning about liberation theology, and I appreciated all those, and I always enjoyed reading the newspapers just to hear about what was going on outside of Canada internationally, and just trying to understand like history and the struggles that were going on. And I had an uncle that traveled, and he invited me to go to Costa Rica and just experience what it was and that was, you know, as a teenager, just exploring and appreciating what was outside of the boundaries of Southern Ontario. And I didn't know too many people that were doing those kind of things at that time. So I knew I was going to university, but I didn't know what, and I just happened to stumble upon an open house at U of T, and that they have a program called International Development. And I looked at the curriculum, and I thought, this is great. This is. I want to go to university, but I didn't know what to study. But these kind of topics and being interested in social justice and the world, and it was multidisciplinary, so it fitted well with my my background, or what I thought I was interested in. It was a co-op program, so that I thought was an interesting component where I could, again, further and understand the world around me. When I started university, I met a number of my colleagues had done a program called Canada with Youth. I hadn't heard about it, and so I took a year off after a couple of years of study to do Canada with Youth, and ended up going back to Costa Rica and living with a family and starting to explore and understand the struggles that the people in these countries were going through in a more profound way. And so I came back to school, and then had my placement year, and a friend of mine was setting up a small project in the Dominican Republic. I had an affinity for Latin American and understanding more of the reality. I was interested in learning Spanish, so it gave me the ability to further explore and learn Spanish. That was a wonderful experience. It was about 6 months long, and then I came back, finished my degree. At that time, it's the early 90s. There was a recession on. The prospects of jobs weren't very good, and many of my colleagues or schoolmates were going back to school to get masters, and the academic world wasn't something that I was interested in pursuing. So I went back to the Dominican Republic as a volunteer to continue with the project that I was involved with, a very grassroots struggle with the Haitian community in the Dominican Republic. So that was my start of learning to appreciate in a more profound way. I went back for a year, and I ended up staying 10 years. And I just did a variety of jobs that led to one thing to another, to do a variety of things, from working at a radio station to working for a dental organization. But it just, the ability to stay and live in the Dominican Republic just furthered my understanding of the struggles and the issues and the different perspectives. When you talk to Canadians, or you come back home, you talk to my family, you know, they understand the issues from a distance, and they will talk about these other countries in certain ways. But Dominicans will see the world from a different perspective, and I just getting to know them very intimately, their view of the world and how different those two perspectives have to somehow fit together. I'm interested in history, so I was looking at the history from the Dominican perspective. Fast forward a bit, so I decided that it was time to come back to Canada for a number of reasons. And that was just, okay, I'm married, I have a child, and what am I going to do with this 10 years of experience? And so I started knocking on doors of the nonprofit sector, looking for something in the field of international development. And I was fortunate, it took about 8 months, but fortunate to land a job as project coordinator for an organization that was working in Africa, principally Ethiopia and Burkina Faso. I have French. I grew up in a Francophone family, and so the person that interviewed me said, well, you speak French, you can take your skills that you learned while you did these various jobs in the Dominican Republic and apply them to the African context. So that was an introduction for me to expand my horizons and continue to work in the field. So it's just been, and from 2000 until now, I've just been working in a number of small organizations in the capacity of project manager, and just being able to live in Canada and understand the context of working in the Canadian context, but always having that ability and a foot and overseas in understanding the reality. So I find what I my biggest role within all the organization is to be an advocate and a voice for the projects that we're supporting and helping the Canadian staff to understand the perspectives and the issues that they're dealing with, and that's pretty much how I ended up where I am today.
Thank you so
Yes.
much, Don. I have my own mic. I'm afraid to breathe to go into the camera there. So I just want to pull out a couple threads. I think, thank you all for that. I think what we're hearing is, family has a big influence on you. Role models that we have that might be inside your family or outside, people of significance, travel, or the opportunity not only to travel but to gain some kind of lived experience to understand things, and then stepping stones. And one of the threads I'm hearing, or I might be hearing because it resonates for me, is this idea of sticking with something and seeing where does it go when you commit to something and you allow opportunities to happen instead of chasing things all the time. I won't go too much into my own experience because I'm watching the clock across the room, but I do want to throw out there that, so I was born in Canada, but I am a military kid. So I often sat wish I was Stephen Lewis's niece or something like that, because sometimes in our sector in international cooperation, it can feel like everybody had that Mitra's relatives, and that wasn't my experience. I was a military kid. I grew up in Ottawa until I was 10, and my parents are both from military families, so very working class, and had lived all over Canada in their years as their childhood. When I was 10, my dad said, we're moving to Germany. And this was in 1980. It was kind of the height of the Cold War. And I thought Germany was in the United States. So I was not nearly as smart as kids these days. My daughter is in grade 1, and she yesterday told me all about Black History Month and Martin Luther King. So I wasn't that swift, obviously. But living in Germany and in Europe in that time, in 1980 to 84, was really influential on me because we had the chance to travel quite a lot because it's easy to travel when you're in Europe. And that's what my parents liked to do, so we got to do that. I also had the chance to go into Berlin. I was on a swim team and with youth, so I was in Berlin young and sort of experienced what it was like in East Berlin and West Berlin, in the wall. And these kind of things sit heavy with you when you're living them. But I was also not at all like my parents or my father. I was anti-military. So in that part of Germany, there was a lot of Greenpeace people, and they would protest all the time near the military base saying, like, Army, go home, and I would join them. And so that was not necessarily a good thing from the vantage point of my father, who wasn't in the Army, he was in the Air Force, and he wasn't a soldier, he was medical, but still, the idea that you can have very conflicting values to what your parents have or roles. So I was exposed in those kind of ways, and I also worked for a long time. I started working when I was 15, and I worked a lot in programming roles, essentially. I was working with children with disabilities, adapted recreation, job coach for people with intellectual disabilities, in a hospital in Toronto with people with head injuries, running programs. So I think that what I can see in my own story of having lived in many different countries, pursuing many different academic programs and volunteering, is like threads that come out in one's journey that is something that it's embedded in you somehow, some kind of interest. So I have a strong interest in working with people and running collaborative activities and programs, and having been exposed to different kind of experiences of people, particularly people with disabilities and people who've lived in difficult circumstances, had opened up a sensitivity in me. So that's a bit of my own personal journey of how any of us gets to where we are in a career. I think that often in university programs these days, I know when I did my undergrad at Guelph, somebody came in to us and we were very social science students, not necessarily skills-based learning. We were writing a lot of essays. And I was quite shocked when some NGO people came in and told us, do you have any skills? Like, have you ever written a proposal? Or are you going to study to be a nurse? Or what do you think you're going to do when you go and work in some other country? What can you offer? I was quite affronted by this, thinking, but I'm studying international cooperation and I believe that we can make a difference. And so I think it's important to both hold that space where you actually may not be a person who was wanting to become a nurse, but actually wanting to look at the issues from a theoretical perspective. Also important, though, was that idea of having a skill set, having something you could actually do or offer that is of value.